You brought up things like charters, things like vouchers, which seems to me as an economist, a different approach. It's an approach based on ultimately allowing the consumer to play a greater role in incentivizing good behavior. And there's some extent to which we might have that in some education markets already. I'm thinking here particularly about suburban education, where people can vote with their feet and go to another district if this district isn't providing what they want. But it's a fundamentally different approach. It doesn't rely on the ability to write down in a formula whether somebody's doing well or not. It's like, maybe I don't have a good formula for saying whether a restaurant is a good restaurant or not, but we don't really worry about lousy restaurants surviving, because guess what? People don't eat there. They stop eating there if the food's not good or the restaurant doesn't meet their needs in some ways. And the consumers drive the bad restaurants out of business and allow the better restaurants to stay and expand.
One little difficulty in applying that analogy exactly to education is defining exactly who the consumers are. So in the first chapter of my book, I make the point that a public role for funding education rests on the observation that some children are born into families where if there were no intervention, either for lack of resources or lack of altruism or lack of just the capacity to make the right decisions, some kids left only to their parents' devices would not get efficient educational investments. So there's a role for government to step in.
But wait a minute, you used a key word that might have slipped by, and you used the word funding, government funding, and you didn't talk about the other word, which is provision. And I heard you talk about this enough times to know that distinction between government funding and government provision is an important one.
Right.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
So it's absolutely crystal clear that there is a role for government to fund education, especially for kids from disadvantaged families, because you can just do the back of the envelope calculations about whatever you think the minimum resource cost it is to provide efficient level of education for a kid. There's a significant fraction of the kids in a developed country whose families don't have that level of resources.
So if it costs $8,000 a year to send a kid to elementary school,
and
a family of four with two kids who has $30,000 in income, probably not going to spend $16,000 a year on their two kids.
Right. And if we all agree in a developed country that it's efficient for every child, from an economic standpoint, it's efficient for every child to learn how to read and write and be literate and have the opportunity to go on to higher education. And we have tons of evidence that investment pays for itself.
So in other words, we're going to put that $8,000 a year into those kids.
Right.
And by putting $8,000 a year into those kids, we're going to get more back in future value.
Right.
Then the return, what we call economists would say, the return on that investment makes that an efficient investment. We get enough back to say that's a wise investment.
Right. And
so if it's a wise investment, why don't the parents make it?
Like we said, they can't make it in many cases because of their incomes. In some cases, they might be able to scrounge enough money, but they're not willing to make the sacrifices they would have to make to do it. So the point is...
But why can't the kids just tell them, hey, I'll pay you back. Invest in me, and when I get older, I'll pay you back?
There's a large literature about whether or not we think those things work. And I think we all know families where we think these types of intergenerational transfers work and are efficient. We've all met families where we think that might not work.
Yeah, I mean, so what you're saying is economics tells us that it may not be feasible for kids to contract with their parents or with a third party to finance their education. They can't go down to JP Morgan and say,
Right.
hey, loan me the money as a 6-year-old. I will go to school for 16 years and I can more than pay you back based on the money that you get. And probably if we signed such a deal, a court probably wouldn't enforce it.
Right.
And secondly, there's good reason to believe the kid probably doesn't have the information or the ability to contract for those investments. Okay, let's put that, so that's part of the problem.
And that's why you see in every developed country, government funds education.
Let me also bring up another point, and this is a point that Gary and I made in a paper years ago, which is, in fact, haven't in most of these developed countries made the problem worse. That is, in a lot of developing countries, and really in the old days in a country like the US, one of the reasons you would sacrifice and invest in creating more earning power for your kids down the road is you were going to depend on them for support when you got to retirement. That, geez, if I ignore my kids, I may suffer the consequences because my kids aren't going to have the income to help support me or run my farm when I get old. And with the advent of society taking on the mantle of caring for the elderly, doesn't that, if anything, cut the other way? It says, look, I'm less dependent on those kids. I mean, the idea that I'm going to invest in my kids because I need them later, probably less true in a modern society than it was years ago.
It is so costly now with the cost of educated labor. It is so costly now to provide quality schooling for children. There's just a large section of the population that are never going to come up with the money. And there's another group that if they could scrounge it together aren't going to make the sacrifices. What you're saying may be one of the reasons why.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. The idea that I'm going to really sacrifice, and we do see groups that do it. We see immigrant families, for example, do make enormous sacrifices to send their kids to school. That they are the person who has relatively low income, but nonetheless diverts an enormous amount of resources to their kids.
Right.
So we do see some people making those kind of sacrifices.
I agree. But we're just piling on here. There's a clear role for the government to fund education, but it's far from clear what mechanism the government should use to take those funds and buy education for children.